Hello watch enthusiasts. Now chronographs can perhaps be seen as the most functional of complications added to a three-hand watch. And so the chronograph has become an extremely popular option for a lot of people who want a little bit more functionality from their respective style of watch, be it a dress watch, a sports watch, a pilot's watch or a dive watch. And so in this video I'd like to talk about these chronographs and what I think in this year 2018 are the best value chronographs on the market, which offer the most to the owner and the individual who will be wearing the watch on a regular basis. In this video I'd like to look at really all price ranges from the more affordable pieces to far more expensive pieces offering more complications. But I think the beauty of this is that in the world of the chronograph there's really a watch for everyone in terms of offering a very high functionality and quality for a reasonable price with a very good quality movement. Now the first watch I'd like to speak about is perhaps an unlikely piece because I haven't spoken about it before. However, knowing Christopher Ward, this watch will be a brilliant timepiece. And this is the Christopher Ward C3 Malvern Chronograph Mark III. And this piece is an interesting model in my opinion, because it combines a very affordable package with a reliable movement with the extremely high case and dial quality that Christopher Ward always put into their watches. And the watch is made in stainless steel in a brushed and polished finish, with very highly polished elements on the bezel and the top of the lugs, with other elements in brushed steel such as the sides of the case, in order to provide a very attractive balance of different finishes to create a far more versatile and also far more interesting piece to look at. Now this watch fits very nicely between a dress watch and an everyday timepiece, so you can wear it really in most occasions and certainly most formal occasions. It has a 39mm case which should be wearable for the vast majority of people, with a relatively short lug-to-lug length, again to make it more wearable. Thanks to its quartz movement, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment, the watch is only 10.8mm thick, making it rather slim in terms of being a chronograph with three hands, but still retaining a certain amount of heft to still feel masculine on the wrist, but nonetheless to have a very subtle and very attractive look, which is very different to any other brand's execution of a chronograph, especially at this price range. And inside this watch there is the Ronda 3520D, and this is a movement which is the first of the Swiss quartz chronographs to have this vertical stacking, which I think works extremely well with this watch because of Christopher Ward's placement of their logo on the left-hand side of the dial. This means that can be balanced by the right-hand side with its subtly sloping and almost architectural in design style of date window, and then having those two subdials with a co-axial subdial at 12 o'clock to show you the various aspects of timekeeping. Of course, on top of this one does have a sapphire crystal to protect the front of the watch, and underneath that one sees a brilliant style of dial which, as I've said, does have architectural elements to it with raised and applied indices which are very nicely faceted and cut, and then with these sunken subdials, which as I've said as well, the 12 o'clock one is slightly larger, and coaxial, so one has the hour counter in the middle of the minute counter. And through this one can also tell the tenths of a second, because the second hand itself jumps in 1 second increments, and so normally wouldn't be accurate to any more than a second, but in this case it is. Then the surface of the dial is rather beautifully done, with a variety of different finishes, with the silver having this matted style, and then a slightly more sunburst style of effect on the blue dial and the black dials. And before I talk about the strap options, I do feel that the reason why I think this watch is such good value is that it offers the same case build as Christopher Ward's more expensive models, but in a far more affordable and accessible package, with the same signing of the crown, the same very nicely decorated caseback, and excellent blued hands. But the one aspect which I do like as well is that Ronda movement, because it means you get a very reliable package which will work very easily and will be very usable for a long period of time. And I find that whilst one can get some mechanical chronographs, such as the Venus-based styles of chronographs made by Alpha, I do feel that this movement will offer greater reliability, because I've owned one of these Alpha watches, and the movement has already been changed once, but in both of these movements I've had continual problems with the hands not working correctly, the chronograph reset not functioning correctly, and likewise it's simply not having the build quality to be a viable everyday timepiece. In terms of strap options, the watch comes either on the standard tang and buckle style of brown leather strap, or £55 more a brown Cordovan style leather strap with a deployant clasp. But also, if you go for the full £480 as opposed to £395, you can get it on a style of very well made mesh bracelet to suit the stainless steel finish of the timepiece. It also comes with its 5-year warranty, which again I think makes this watch a very good option for an everyday chronograph with genuine elegance, with a very reliable and well-made movement, and a general aesthetic and beauty which I think can't be rivalled. Now the following watch does move up in terms of pricing to £1,100. However, this Tissot is a piece which was released last year, around this time in fact last year, and is a piece which originally didn't particularly interest me. But over time this watch has grown on me enormously, and I think the elegance of its lines is unrivalled at this price range. And this is the Tissot Heritage 1948, an automatic chronograph with all the style you would expect from the brand, and a touch of history to it, which doesn't appear too much and too overbearing. And this watch clearly harks back to earlier days of Tissot's manufacturing, with those beautiful leaf-style hands, and that wonderful straight second hand with those black elements on the dial. Likewise, it uses Tissot's old logo, which is by far the most attractive they've had, with a slightly inset minute counter around the edge of the dial, as well as the numerals at each quadrant. And this is a watch which, whilst commemorating the past, doesn't appear to get lost in it with aged luminova, which I think is probably a good thing, because that means that this watch won't appear dated in time, but rather will simply remain a classic and very elegant design. Now, the case of the watch is stainless steel and is polished with some brushed elements on the sides of the case to just break up that finish somewhat. It's 40mm in diameter, which again makes it a very wearable size, but also retaining a certain size and heft, which means that the dial will still appear somewhat smaller, but with an area which actually covers a lot of the watch. And then in keeping with watches of the 1940s and of its original era, the watch has these beautifully beveled and sharpened lugs, which protrude in that Chronographs style from the sides of the case, but in a way which is far more 1940s, and somewhat more in keeping with Tissot's work than the Chronographs styles from other brands. Then, of course, one also has the very thick polished bezel, which runs around the edge of that domed crystal, which is a beautiful addition, I think, and works very, very well with this watch, with its Hess-like crystal, which works like acrylic, and so as a result won't have the harshness of sapphire, but rather the softness of an older plastic crystal. Likewise, the crown is flat and pressed against the case, which is once again very true to the original model, and then one has the pushers, which are very subtly placed against the side of the case, which was also a good move to make this watch more wearable as a dress watch as well as an everyday timepiece. Now, the watch is only 11.9mm thick, which to any Valjoux 7750 wearer will seem rather slim. And the reason for this is that Tissot have used an ETA movement, but they haven't used a Valjoux movement. What they've used is the ETA 2894-2, which is a 37-jewel automatic chronograph with this wonderful horizontal layout to the chronograph subdials, which makes for a far more classic look, and I think works much better on a dress watch like this than on a professional style of chronograph. And that means that you have a very reliable automatic 42-hour power reserve movement, which can be easily serviced, but which provides you with this excellent chronograph layout, and which will no doubt last long into the future. The chronograph is also partly visible through the two windows in the caseback, which are something which some people like and others don't, but I personally think give a slight bit of charm to this watch, a certain flair, which makes this watch appear with its slightly cream dial and those sunburst effect subdials. It makes it appear like something you would see on the wrist of someone in a Parisian cafe, for example, in the 1940s, which is quite brilliant to see and a wonderful nod to the past, with of course its 30-minute and 12-hour chronograph subdials and subsidiary seconds and date placed at 4:30 in matching colour to the dial. And so whether you go for the version on the leather strap or indeed on the Milanese style of mesh bracelet, I think this is a fantastic watch for £1,100, with a real elegance and beauty which will no doubt last with someone for many, many years in terms of being an interesting piece to own and one which can be enjoyed in so many different contexts. The next watch is a piece which was designed specifically to be a successor to the style of pilot's watches from the 1950s and 60s, and to be something far more modern. And this piece is the Sinn 144. And I've chosen the 144 for this video because it presents a piece which is a wonderful hybrid between a more modern pilot's or astronaut's watch with the classic forms of a sporting chronograph, such as, for example, a racing timepiece, in a very wearable package which is extremely versatile and well thought out. Now, the case of the watch is stainless steel and is 41mm in diameter with a short lug-to-lug length because one has these hooded lugs. Likewise, the watch is 14.5mm in thickness, which again makes it more wearable in terms of thickness than thicker timepieces would be in terms of wearing this on a daily basis. Now, this watch does come in some higher-end versions in the £2,000 price range, but I won't go into those models. I'm talking primarily of the base model, which is simply a 3-hand and 3 additional hand chronograph, so a 6-hand chronograph, without the additional second time zone, because I think for the vast majority of people this offers a more useful package, because it is that little bit more affordable, and as a result will be more accessible. And the timepiece features the very typical Sinn design for a Avigation 7750, with the 12-hour counter at 6 o'clock, the 30-minute counter at 12 o'clock, and then of course the chronograph seconds also in red to match those two other hands running around the edge of the dial. Then one has the current and running seconds on the left-hand side of the dial, and a day-date complication with matching date wheels and day wheel on the right-hand side of the dial, with Sinn above and automatic. And powering this watch is the Avigation 7750, which is a very, very well respected and very simple, you could say, in terms of having a cam operation rather than any sort of column wheel, is a very reliable and very robust mechanical movement. And Sinn do decorate their movements and are known for regulating their movements extremely well. Then of course the watch itself is 200 metres water resistant, which means you don't have to worry about swimming with this watch if you ever do choose to, or you simply forget it on your wrist. There really will be no harm that will come to this watch, though of course I wouldn't advise using the pushes underwater. And likewise, because it's designed to be a pilot's watch, it is negative pressure resistant, so if it suffers sudden decompression, the crystal won't pop off, which is again an attractive aspect. Now, running on the inside of the dial alongside those central markers and those beautifully loomed hands and markers is a tachometer with a pulsometer, and these two will allow a certain additional function with an internal bezel, which means this doesn't have the danger of being scratched, and also reduces the frontal footprint of the watch. Interestingly, despite being a very professional chronograph and having that water resistance of 200 metres, it does still have a sapphire exhibition caseback through which you can look at the very well decorated movement and the blued screws mounted to it, which I think just add to the enjoyment of one of these watches. Then of course there is the matter of the various pricings of these watches, because these watches come between £1,720 and £1,885, depending upon which model you go for and which strap option. And one optional extra, which is seldom mentioned but appears to be available on the Sinn website from what they say, is AR dehumidifying technology. And the mounting point is seen in the side of the case of this watch as sort of a screw hole. But if you do choose this option, one can have the capsule of copper sulfate mounted to the side of the watch, and what this does is that it absorbs moisture inside the case, which is already filled with argon, an inert gas, in order to reduce the effects of moisture and the presence of air and oxidization on the metallic parts and the oils inside the movement. And the copper sulfate capsule mounted in the side of the case can be replaced when it's serviced, and this absorbs the moisture inside the watch and turns blue, so you can tell just how much moisture it's absorbed, and one knows that when it's completely blue it's time to send it in for a service to have that replaced. And so I find this watch to be an extremely good option for someone who wants a reliable, well-made and very crisply designed German chronograph, with a Swiss movement, a very well-made Swiss movement at that, as well as all these functions in terms of a beautifully made and manufactured dial and case, which gives you a really brilliant build, and with touches such as that AR dehumidifying, and the fact that there are in fact two mounting points inside those hooded lugs, not just the one. And what this means is that you can mount the strap or bracelet on different levels to make it wear flatter for a larger wrist, or for the lugs to curve down more for a smaller wrist to make it really perfect for each owner. And so I feel for the price of £1,720 to £1,885 for this version, it really is a fantastic option for someone who wants a professional chronograph. The next watch is a piece which I've spoken about before on this channel, and I think a lot of people have spoken about before, but I still think it's a wonderful option, a brilliantly designed piece from Longines. And I got to see the Longines Avigation BigEye at Baselworld this year, and I was very impressed to see this watch because it is a real beauty on the on that beautiful strap, and it's a timepiece which is stainless steel and is rooted in the history of aviation. Of course, this watch is designed on the typical lines of an aviation chronograph, based on some of Longines' products of the 20th century, and does have a distinct flair of the 1950s to it, with that matte black dial and sunken sub-registers, giving a beautiful look to this watch. The dial is in fact very simple on this timepiece, with simply Longines automatic on it with Swiss made at the bottom of the dial, with this black base, which is then painted on with these indices which run around the edge of the dial and provide a very good legibility. Likewise, one has these asymmetrical styles of subdials, which hark back to the original model of this watch produced, with the running seconds on the left-hand side of the dial, the 12-hour gauge at 6 o'clock, and then with a matching style of diamond-shaped hand, one has the BigEye minute for the chronographs. And this piece is a very large and sunken subdial with a very different aesthetic without numerals, in 3-minute graduations running to 30 minutes. And this makes for a very, very legible look to the watch, and an aesthetic which I think is phenomenal to see on a watch which is new, yet still retains a certain respect for the past without appearing overly old-fashioned. Now, to further soften the look of this watch, the timepiece features a domed sapphire crystal, which is very heavily double-domed and in a bubble form, which gives wonderful distortions and further accentuates the concentric rings seen on the subdials, which give a wonderful look, as well as the polished elements, which match the polished bevels along the edge of the bezel, as well as the crown and pushers. Now, as the name would suggest, this watch does have a distinct heritage in terms of aviation, and this is also reflected in the case back with an aircraft engraved into the back. Likewise, the pushers are very large to be operated with gloves, which I think work very, very well with this design, whilst the crown appears smaller and sits very nicely unguarded between those two. The case itself is 41mm in diameter by 14.45mm in thickness with a 50mm lug-to-lug. So it's by no means a small watch and will wear larger due to its lug-to-lug length than its 41mm size may perhaps suggest. However, I do think this is a very interesting piece, which offers something very different for its price of £1,940. But internally I feel this watch is perhaps its most interesting aspect, because inside this watch is mounted the caliber L688.2, which is a 7750 Veloujou modified to have a 54-hour power reserve, as well as some particular features specific to this watch. For a start, the movement is extremely well decorated inside this watch, with a really beautiful finishing across its surfaces and finishes. But the most important part is that this watch, for this price, has a column wheel. And I find it impressive, frankly, that this movement is possible for this sort of price, because it isn't simply a Veloujou 7750 that's been modified, but rather they've actually had this movement commissioned and made by ETA. And so this does mean this movement is made specifically for this line of watches, albeit a few other models in the Longines range also use it, but it has been produced specifically for the brand, which means they're able to produce a watch specifically around the functions of the movement, without there being trouble retrofitting the older movement with these more modern changes, such as the column wheel, to give a stutter-free and more sudden start and more crisp start to the chronograph. Now, I think it would be fair to say that Longines know the way around a vintage-inspired watch with their Conquest Heritage, their Legend Diver, as well as their new Skin Diver or Nautilus, which I think is a beautiful-looking timepiece which just came out at Baselworld. And this watch is a piece which is very tastefully done, with mint green luminova on it, as well as an unaged case, but still with elements harking back to the past, and a size which is thoroughly wearable. This is a timepiece which bridges that gap between the old and the new, and creates something which is both elegant, sporty, but also highly functional in its aesthetic, for a price which I think is very, very impressive. The final brand, and indeed watch I'd like to speak about, is Dodane. And this is a brand which is often ignored or simply not known about, because they're a brand which has remained very much aside from the well-known brands such as Omega and Rolex for a long time. But this is a brand which has an incredible heritage, and as you can see on the screen, this is the Type 21, which was one of their watches from the 1950s, produced as a military piece for the French Air Force, alongside the Type 20 from BigEye, for example. And this was a watch which in fact endured the longest of the various type chronographs for the French Air Force, and shows this brand to be a particularly reliable and interesting brand as far as these military chronographs go. And the brand itself has lasted a very, very long time, as you can see, since 1857, which for a small brand like this that's remained in the family is rather rare. Now, this piece I'd like to speak about today is the Type 23. And the Type 23 is a reimagined version of their original pilot's chronograph, but built to more modern specifications, with some adjustments, some changes to the lugs, for example, in the case build, but still is very much in keeping with models which are even today sold to the French Air Force. And the case is 42.5mm in stainless steel, with 100-metre water resistance, even with those pushers and crown exposed. Then, sitting atop the watch, one sees this bezel, which is a timing bezel or a 12-hour bezel, which you can specify when you order it, allowing you to either time minutes, or if you want to time hours, then you can also do that. And the hour bezel might be quite useful, because it's a GMT bezel, so you can either use it for a separate time zone, or, bearing in mind the fact that the chronograph on this watch is simply a 30-minute chronograph, if you line up the 12-hour bezel with the hour hand, you can then use it as a full 12-hour chronograph, which is a quirk of having that bezel, which is why I'd probably go for that. Then on the inside of the dial, one sees the wonderful Rehort, which features a style of chaptering, which has a tachymeter on it, a base 1000 tachymeter, allowing you to measure speed over a covered and given distance. Now, before I speak about the rest of the case, I would like to speak about the chronograph movement, because this is crucial to understanding the watch. Inside the watch features an ETA movement, which has then been modified by Dubois-Duprat, who very famously worked on the first automatic chronograph, in fact, with Hoyer. And what they've created is the module 2030, which provides a bicompax layout chronograph for a standard ETA movement. And this enables the watch to have this chronograph function on this particular setup, which works so well. And the reason why I've started pricing on the screens you can see at £3,030 running to £3,568 is because I've included an optional extra in that price, which I would say isn't so much an option so much as a requirement if you buy this watch, because it's something which is so crucial to this timepiece. And that is the inclusion of a flyback chronograph. Now, as standard, using the module 2030, you get a standard chronograph where you start the chronograph and stop it with the top pusher, and then once stopped, you reset it with the bottom pusher. However, if you spend the additional money on moving this up to the flyback version, which has the Dubois-Duprat module 42030, you get the flyback complication. That means that alongside these other functions, if you press the bottom pusher whilst the chronograph is running, it will jump back to 0 and restart, all in a single action. Now, this is crucial to this watch in terms of being able to time consecutive distances and times without any break or gap, which would have been crucial for map reading in one of these aircraft, which is why I'd say one has to really go for this option, because one may as well enjoy the options which Dodane is so well known for. Now, thanks to the fact this is a module movement, one has a 45 jewel setup, which is very, very highly decorated with blued screws and a coulis-maçon finishing on the bridges. And the story of this watch is that it was originally funded with the 2012 sale of 750 watches to the French Air Force, which allowed this watch to be developed to this stage. And aside from the option of which chronograph version to go for, whether you go for the flyback or the standard, you do have the option of case finishing, whether you have it finished in this brushed stainless steel, or indeed if you go for the brushed black PVD stainless steel, which gives a darker, more military look to the watch, but does lose some of that classic charm. Likewise, one has the option of either the standard white luminova, which again is the more classic option, or this bright fluorescent yellow colour, which is more in keeping with their aircraft clocks, which is more legible in more circumstances, especially in the modern world of nighttime vision, for example, which makes this watch particularly interesting for professional pilots. And of course, bearing in mind that it has to fit within military specifications, it has the option and the development of the use of anti-magnetic technology as well as anti-shock protection. And so, bearing in mind the attention to detail that Dodane put in, with, for example, the mounting points for the bracelet or strap featuring 2 screw holes, allowing you to really secure the choice of strap or bracelet in position, and altogether the design of the sloped-down lugs, the very beautifully but very clearly designed dial, and really the brilliantly careful aesthetic they've chosen to follow a classic look, but with all the modern technology you would expect. And I had the pleasure of meeting Dodane last year, in fact, at Baselworld, and it was a real pleasure to be able to discuss these watches with them, and to be able to look at some of their pieces. Because as far as family brands that work, for example, in Besançon, which is where they're based, there's very little to go on. And of course, the world of French watches is somewhat limited these days, so it really is brilliant to see a brand producing something beautifully made and of extremely high quality. And so I'll conclude the video here, but do leave your comments down below as to what you thought of the video, and indeed what you thought of my choices, which in my eyes are all very interesting pieces, which are somewhat different from the standard watches one often sees. And if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.